Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to extend thanks for my son to those who helped send funds down as they picked up food and drinks and things and took them down to those Haitians in Del Rio that are overwhelming their town. Their church has got a impromptu ministry. They just said, what can we do? Rather than trying to use those people's plight as some political agenda, they just said, hey, there are a bunch of people who need some help. How do we help them? And it's encouraging to hear that that's the way people are seeing things, and hopefully our eyes will be open in the same ways, that we'll see the needs of people as the needs of people and ask that question, how can we as the church show love to them? As we come into today's text, I'm going to be talking more about it. This is a series that we've been going through on those times when Jesus said, follow me. And I titled this sermon, Follow Me to Escape Your Enemies. But I want to begin with a story from the Old Testament. A time whenever King Saul sent men to surround David's house. King Saul had actually given his men orders not only to capture David, but to kill him. But they weren't supposed to do it until the next morning. As they waited during the night to enter into David's house, David prayed. This is his prayer from Psalm 59, verses 1 and 2 of that psalm. Deliver me from my enemies, O God. Set me securely on high, away from those who are rising up against me. Deliver me from those who do iniquity, and save me from men of bloodshed. I think David meant every word of it. He knew his predicament, and that predicament is recorded in 1 Samuel 19. King Saul didn't like David's successes. He had just defeated the Philistines in a great battle, and the people were singing his praises. And it looked like he was sort of the rising next star of Israel. And Saul wanted to get rid of David before the people began to seek him as perhaps the next king in place of his son Jonathan. David really wasn't aware of the intensity of Saul's growing jealousy and his desire to keep sort of the crown and the family with Jonathan. And so he sort of enters in innocently into Saul's chambers. He recognizes that Saul is upset, doesn't seem to really understand why, and brings out his harp to play for him to sort of soothe the savage beast, just to calm him down. Saul doesn't calm down. He picks up his spear, and it doesn't tell us whether he throws it or he lunges with it, but he tries to impale David with it, and David dodges. He recognizes he's in danger, and he fled into the night. It was then that Saul gave those orders for those men to follow David and go to his house and to surround it, and then to enter in the next morning. David's prayer was answered. It was answered by his faithful wife, who told David, you need to save yourself tonight, or tomorrow morning you're going to be dead. That was her words to him. He listened to her, and he allowed her to lower him through a window, and he made his escape into the night. She, on the other hand, took a household idol. Don't ask me why there were idols in David's house, but he had idols. And it was big enough that she put it in the bed and covered it up so that it looked like David sleeping there. And she even put some sheep's wool on its head so it looked like it had hair. She was really doing her best. And she left it there. And so the next morning, whenever Saul's men came and they knocked on the door and demanded entry, she told them, well, David's sick. He can't come to the door right now. She lied. They didn't trust her. They wanted to see David for themselves. She led them up to the room. They saw the bed, and they were not fooled. Not even for a little bit. They essentially arrested her and took her back to King Saul, which happened to be her father. and he wanted to know why she had given such treachery. It might not have been obvious at the time to David, but whenever he looked back on that night of his escape, he realized that God had answered his prayer. And that's what spurred him to write that song. He recalled how he prayed for deliverance and God had provided it. He escaped not because he and his wife were so clever. He escaped because God provided a way of escape. We're often reminded in the scriptures that God always provides a way of escape, even when it comes to being surrounded not by our enemies, but just by temptation. It's temptations that we think are too much for us. The problem is that we don't always see it as a way of escape that God is providing, or we choose not to take his way. Our nation just observed the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And it seems that overall, little was really made of it in the news. The celebrations that were held didn't seem to get much notice. That day in 2000 is when our country was attacked by Muslim men waging a holy war against us, even though most of us at the time didn't realize it or were certainly unaware that they had declared war on us. Some 2,977 people were killed. 19 hijackers committed what we would call murder-suicide, and more than 6,000 others were injured. Their attacks targeted the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and the White House, but only 2 of those targets were hit. Our nation's response drew us into a series of wars. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and against Al-Qaeda in its various forms in its various places around the world, which is still going on today. These Muslim men viewed us, our nation, as a great evil in this world. And they wanted to stop us from spreading our evil ways. We in the church may not like everything about our national culture, but it is a culture that has been embraced by people around the world as something that is good, as something that is liberating, as something that offers a better way of living than what they are currently experiencing. But it is also a culture that has been and continues to be critical of how the Muslims who attacked us choose to live and how their culture treats people, especially those who want to choose to live a different way, and particularly in how they treat women. You see, they faced a problem. Many living in the lands that were under their influence were beginning to turn away from their form of Islam and wanted to embrace what they saw in the West. These people wanted to experience the same sort of freedoms that we enjoy, to choose for themselves how they might live. These Muslim men did not see themselves as the problem that they were trying to escape. They saw us as the problem. They saw us as the temptation. They became convinced that if they could just cut off the head of the evil American serpent that was invading their culture, then it would die. That is, our influence in their country would stop, and we would never pose a threat to their culture again. So they devised and they carried out their plan of attack. I don't know if you heard it, but it caught my attention from a news report this last week, when there was this video clip of a Taliban representative saying that after their recent takeover of Afghanistan, they don't want us messing with their cultural standards again. And they are more than willing to eliminate anyone under their rule who would rather embrace American cultural standards, or even Christian ones for that matter. Most of us have been pretty upset by what we've been seeing. I want to take you back in time with me. I want you to remember where you were, if you were around, on 9/11. I remember exactly where I was. I was at St. Vincent's Hospital in Santa Fe. I was moving from one ICU unit to another between a husband and a wife. They were both in critical condition. I remember watching the TV monitor in one of their rooms because the other room wasn't on, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing unfold in New York. It just seemed so unreal. There was a part of me that was really wondering, why would anyone want to attack us that way? But I was also watching a different unreal situation. I was watching two people who loved each other slip away at the same time. They would both be sent home. They would be put on hospice, and I would continue to visit them most days for the rest of September and in through most of October. They were in the same bed, and when I would arrive, they were often holding hands. And they were usually smiling. Mary would usually be laughing. She would actually ask me if I understood why she was smiling, and I would ask her why, and she would share something with me. She goes, I don't know why it is. It just struck me as funny. And she was always happy. We would talk, and she understood well that their lives in this world were coming to an end. But they also knew that their life would extend beyond the grave because of their hope in Christ. They died only days apart, and I would have the honor of leading for them a double funeral in celebration of their life and their hope in Christ. In the midst of caring for them, our congregation was also trying to figure out how to respond to what was happening in the world around us. We held special prayer meetings. We opened our doors to anyone who wanted to stop by and pray or talk. We did what we could to encourage people to keep expressing the love of God whenever we were unsure about the world. I was also, at that time, asked to lead a different funeral service. A service for someone who committed suicide on 9/11. Because it was, from her perspective, just one more thing that made life unbearable. It was a difficult service. She didn't share our faith. It was sad. Looking back, reflecting on what we did compared to what others did during that time, we could have done things better, but we could certainly have done things a lot worse. We made a difference in the lives of a lot of people, but we didn't pose any threat to the world in doing so. There was no one who surrounded our church and wanted to attack us for the things that we were doing. There was no one trying to arrest us. There was no one threatening to kill us because we were trying to do our best to serve in God's name. Reflecting on these events in light of today's scripture that we read earlier, it makes me wonder, is the church, not just our congregation, but those who have accepted the invitation to follow Jesus, is the church a threat to the culture around us, wherever we are? Are we, in following Jesus, making such a difference in his name that the world wants to do whatever it can to stop us from impacting its choices, its culture? You know, it's only when the church poses a threat of changing the culture around us that we are opposed, seen as a threat. And in challenging people to follow Jesus, we should pose that sort of threat to the world, one person at a time, pulling away from the world and closer to Jesus, changing the way that they live and the way that they see things and the way they do things. It is often more noticeable in other cultures, but American culture and the culture of those following Jesus is growing further and further apart. We really do advocate a different way of living. We advocate a different series of choices. We offer a better way of life. And yes, the world around us is starting to notice, and they don't like it much. But still, many in the church are leaving the church in favor of moving to the culture of the world. We are, in some ways, facing a similar problem. What are we to do about people who are leaving us to that tempting culture? In this series of looking at the times when Jesus said, "Follow me," we've come to that point whenever those words were delivered by someone else. They were spoken by an angel to Peter. It happened whenever the persecution was primarily aimed at the leaders of the emerging church. The old adage of cut off the head to kill the snake was being adhered to by King Herod. Cut off the head is a widely used idiom, meaning that you can stop a larger problem by aiming at the source, often the leader or the major culprit of it. The implication is that the rest of the problem will naturally just sort of die off without that influence of the head. The remaining disciples, those committed to following Jesus, were seen as that source by King Herod. He had seized some of the leaders of the church, hoping to make an example of them, showing what would happen if you dared follow his teachings. As Jesus foretold, and as we read in the scriptures, James drank from the same cup of which Jesus drank. James was put to death for his faith that Jesus was the Christ, and proclaiming that he had risen from the dead and that he alone offers forgiveness of sins and the hope of eternal life, and that by following him, his life would change to following his commands. His death pleased those Jews who found his faith blasphemous. The gospel was seen by them as a threat to their way of living, and the implied approval from their pleasure of James's death led King Herod to arrest Peter, the perceived ringleader of the emerging church. King Herod didn't act quickly after arresting Peter, we find out. He delayed because it was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, 7 days of celebration which culminated in the observance of the Passover. It's probably why Peter was in Jerusalem to start with, in a way that he could be seen and heard and captured. Herod's plan was to put Peter to death after the celebration. He took every precaution he could imagine to keep Peter secure during the celebration. But there is one thing that Herod didn't consider. And even had he thought about it, there was nothing he could have done about it. And that was God's intervention. Peter slept soundly. That's what Luke says. Imagine sleeping soundly when you have 2 guards on either side of you, 2 chains securing you, guards posted around. There's no natural way of escape. Nothing's going to get you out of this predicament. But we know that God specializes in the impossible, don't we? The angel whom the Lord sent had to poke Peter in the side just to wake him up. Then he directed Peter to get up, get dressed, and he used those words that we're studying. Follow me. Peter obeyed. But he thought it was just a dream. It was just something too good to be true. How could this really be happening? It wasn't until he was out in the street that Peter understood that the Lord really had rescued him. It was an answer to prayer, even if Luke didn't record that prayer. I can't imagine that Peter wouldn't have been praying for his own deliverance, as we might do whenever we think that we are surrounded by our enemies. His prayer was answered like David's prayer was answered, because God wasn't finished using him yet, just as he wasn't finished using David yet. Peter made his way to the home, we find, of John Mark's mother. John Mark would spend time with Peter, a lot of time with Peter. He would hear the gospel from Peter in a dramatic way. And later, he would end up traveling with Paul and Barnabas on a missionary trip from which he would leave early to head back to Jerusalem. Paul wasn't too excited that he had left in the middle of the mission trip, so to speak. And so on the next trip, he wouldn't take John Mark, but Barnabas would. But later on, that anger was let go of. Paul was in prison, and John Mark was one of those who showed up to provide comfort and care for Paul, for which he was very thankful. And Paul would end up counting John Mark as a fellow worker. He is mentioned by Paul several times in his letters in a really positive way. And if you didn't know, John Mark is also the most likely author of the Gospel of Mark, which we understand is probably Peter's recollection. That's how close John Mark was to Peter. Peter, who stood at the gate of his mother's house on this night, banging on it until a servant girl comes in. She recognizes his voice. She knows it's Peter, but she doesn't open the gate. Her claim to fame, Rhoda's 5 minutes of fame, is for leaving Peter standing at the gate as she runs in to announce to everyone else that he's outside the gate. Peter keeps pounding at the gate as she tells those who keep pondering at the absurdity of it. They just couldn't believe it was real. They immediately, the first thing they can think of, well, maybe it's his ghost. Maybe he's already dead. This is a spirit. They can't figure it out. They were probably praying for his escape too. They just couldn't believe that God answered their prayer. I don't know about you, but sometimes we only think our prayers hit the ceiling. We wonder if God's really going to do anything, if he'll provide that way of escape that he promises. But the truth of it finally broke through, and they understood their situation, and they quickly go to the gate, and they open the door before Peter is noticed and discovered by anyone else that might be looking for him, and they would do so soon. Luke tells us that Peter actually had to calm them down so that he could tell them the story of his escape. And when he was finished telling it, Peter asked if they would just do one thing for me. If you would just spread the news of my deliverance to James the brother of Jesus, because the other James is now dead, and to the other leaders of the church in Jerusalem. And the story, of course, went viral. Peter, not wanting any of them to be arrested for harboring a fugitive, left to find another place to stay, one in which he could stay hidden and not be found. You see, good news travels quickly, but when this news was heard by King Herod, he didn't consider it good. King Herod makes a search of the city, sending his guards out everywhere looking for Peter. And believe me, those guards were motivated. They knew what was going to happen if they didn't find Peter. In his rage, because he wasn't found, King Herod examines his guard. They must have pleaded that they had no idea what happened to him, and King Herod just couldn't believe what they said. The scriptures only say that he ordered them to be led away. A lot of English translations say that they were led off to be killed. That is probably what took place, but it's not exactly what the act says. They were just led away, but we know what that means. You see, King Herod surmised that one of them must have been at fault, and the others were just covering up for him. They must have been bribed. That was believable, much more believable than the story surrounding and going around town that some angel showed up and Peter escaped into the night. Since that's what Herod believed, that's what Herod acted on. He got rid of the guards. He didn't think he could trust them. Luke tells us that it wasn't long after Herod sort of took care of business that he gives up his search for Peter and he leaves Jerusalem to spend time down in Caesarea, which is on the coast, a place where he could relax and be away from hard work in Jerusalem. Peter, on the other hand, stays in Jerusalem. He stays in a very dangerous place for him. A place where Peter would continue to faithfully proclaim the good news of Jesus' resurrection until he too would follow in the footsteps of Jesus, as had James, that he would drink from that same cup of death for his faith. Peter's death is not recorded in the Bible. It's not in our text for today. Ours was his escape. But it is mentioned in the first book of Clement. He was crucified in Rome, taken there as a prisoner because of his faith. And according to another early church leader, Origen, he was crucified upside down because he didn't think himself worthy to be crucified exactly as Jesus. He was a martyr. The Greek word for martyr shows up 35 times in the New Testament. 12 of those in the book of Acts. It simply is a word that means to witness, to be a witness. It is why Jesus called these disciples to follow him. He said, I want you to be my witnesses. I want you to be my martyrs. Not every martyr's life ends in death, but so many have over the years that we now think of martyr as referring only to those who witness the results of his death. If Jesus invited you, I want you to come and follow me. I want you to be my martyrs. Would you sign up? When we follow Jesus, as did Peter, even if the invitation was to follow, would you do so? You see, sometimes, even though the word to follow came on this occasion to Peter through an angel, it led to safety. Very often, we are willing to follow Jesus if it leads to safety. And if it just leads to a better way of living life. If it just leads to a bigger house and a nicer car and a better job and good people around us, I'm willing to sign up for suffering for Jesus like that. Let me tell you, if just blessing on blessing on blessing, give me that. I'm willing to follow you, Jesus, into a good life. We want to follow Jesus whenever we know that he is going to provide that impossible escape from our enemies. But that hope is tempered with what we know is the rest of the story, isn't it? We know that one day, as Jesus foretold, Peter would not be delivered from his enemies. He would be put to death instead. I want to point out that Peter's death, when it came, didn't kill the evil snake of the church that was impacting people's lives in a way in which they started living differently, in a way that was threatening the Jewish culture, and so they were desperately trying to figure out how to get rid of it. From this point forward in the book of Acts, the focus moves from Peter to Paul, another faithful witness, who himself would have numerous times when he would be given God's deliverance and he would escape time and again. But the day would come when he would be put to death for his faith. Followers of Jesus, whoever they are, will always challenge the culture of the world around them. We marvel at these early believers and how they came to Christ and how they impacted the world around them, how they called them to a better way of living that was very different from the culture around them, and how that culture always tried to figure out how to get rid of the influence of the church. Following Jesus really does lead to a different way of living. And we will be opposed for it. We will be punished for it. We'll be imprisoned for it. Some will even be killed for it. Just look up the Voice of the Martyrs that gives reports of people around the world whose faithful witness leads to their deaths or the threat of it. We live in a place in which we have so many opportunities, and we are not threatened like so many of our brothers and sisters around the world. Killing Peter, killing James, killing Paul, killing anyone will never kill the snake of the church, because Jesus is the head of the church. I don't know about you, about imagining the church as the snake. It's something that almost goes wrong there for me. But we should be sort of a threat to the world around us. But they can't cut off the head of the snake because they've already tried that. They killed Jesus, but he conquered death. He rose from the grave. He ascended into heaven. He sent us, his church, his Spirit. And he who is still alive today continues to have us be his witnesses to the world. He wants us to share God's love for the world, his desire for us to come to him, and the changes and the impact it makes in our lives and the impact of the culture around us. No opposition, no matter how great, will ever stop the problem of the church. The church will continue to be the church. We'll continue to figure out how to love the best that we can, being faithful to Jesus. We'll continue to be a powerful witness for God's love for the world until he comes again. Yeah. We have regulations from COVID-19. You got to put a mask on. We don't like that. Sometimes we got to stay distant from one another. Maybe you have to take a vaccine. Maybe not. But we can continue to be the church with that. That's not going to keep us from being his witnesses. It's not like they're putting a gag on us and telling us that we can't share the gospel, that we can't love the people around us, that we can't make a difference. But there are a lot of people acting as if they were. We can continue to offer a better way of living that will impact and change our culture. The people who choose to follow Jesus should be dangerous people, people whose changed lives is threatening the culture of the world around us, and it should be to the point that they feel so threatened that they want to do something about us. I hope that you live that life, a life that threatens the world around us because of your love and your grace and your forgiveness and your mercy and how drastically different it is from the world. We're going to have a hymn of invitation. And I want to invite you not only to long for those times when God provides you the way of escape, but to remember that our job is not to worry about those times of whether we escape or we don't, but to be faithful witnesses. Would you please stand?